Today is Gaudete Sunday. That's why we have the rose vestments. The rose candle is lit on the Advent wreath. Gaudete means rejoice. So we are supposed to rejoice, for we are now more than halfway through the Advent season, so much closer to celebrating the coming of our Lord. And this Sunday really is meant to teach us that God desires that kind of the overall way of living for us ought to be one of joy. Yet there are so many in our world today who seem to live in an almost perpetual state of misery, sadness, depressed. And maybe even for ourselves, maybe there might be certain circumstances in our life now that seems to have pushed away any experience of joy. But God tells us that this week we must rejoice. So what does it mean to have joy, and how can we live that way? It might be helpful for us to consider what joy is. Because it tends to be, joy, something that we kind of know it when we have it, more than being able to define it precisely. The first reading today uses images rather than a definition for it. The desert and the parched land will exult. The steppe will rejoice and bloom. They will bloom with abundant flowers and rejoice with joyful song. They will meet with joy and gladness. Sorrow and mourning will flee. See, we make this distinction between joy and happiness because it's really more than happiness. Just as happiness is more than experiencing pleasure. Now, if we think about it, pleasure is kind of on just kind of a physical level. We maybe have pleasure in eating a meal. But happiness is a step up. It's something within our mind, within our emotions. And joy is just another level deeper within us as well. Really at the heart, the center of who we are, we experience joy. So we can kind of begin to see that it's possible actually to experience joy in our life even when maybe we don't feel happy or are experiencing pleasure. But if we look to St. Thomas Aquinas, he kind of explains where joy comes from. He says it comes out of love. Specifically, maybe the experience of joy of being with somebody that we love and knowing that they love us deeply, so a spouse or family, being with them, or even when we're apart from them, knowing that things are well for them, that they're being taken care of. Or when we have a proper love for ourselves. There can be joy there when things are well for ourselves. Or the greatest source of joy comes from God, of knowing that He is there with us. We're abiding with Him, and that all the things that He does all things well for us and our families. St. Thomas also says that no man can live without joy. We can't live without joy. He says that if we're deprived of joy, then we try to search it out by looking to other places, oftentimes just carnal pleasures. We try to substitute it for things that really don't make us joyful. Pleasures that oftentimes for some people lead to addictions that enslave us and then even rob us even more of any kind of joy. But the good news is that no matter how someone might feel, no matter how dark it might seem to be, God can draw us out of that, back into joy. Sometimes we let the circumstances of life deprive us of spiritual joy. It could be even something, as small perhaps as the change in weather. That might, one point we're all joyful, and then another point we're in deep sadness. But you might ask, well, does this mean if we're supposed to be joyful, does that mean we never can be sad? Father, do I have to go around pretending like everything's all right if there's actually things going wrong? Well, no, that's not really what Christian joy is about. Spiritual joy actually often will take place even in the midst of difficulties. It doesn't wait for everything to be perfect. It doesn't wait for sufferings to go away. Joy often comes about because of those things. Let me explain. I mentioned earlier from Thomas that joy comes out of love. But he also says that sorrow comes out of love as well. Because when we maybe are separated from the one that we love, or maybe when we see that they're not doing as well as we would desire them to be, or when ourselves, we are not doing as well, or when we feel like God is apart from us, or we're far from him, that's when we can experience sorrow. But sorrow comes out of love, just like joy does. And so that means that if we have love, then we can experience both. And sometimes there's kind of a mixture at the same time. An example I think of is a mother. She has to go through the suffering and labor of the birth of the child before she then experiences the great joy of seeing the child for the first time come into the world. But the joy of being able to hold the newborn child is so much greater for the fact that she has endured that suffering. And that's oftentimes how joy is for our life. It's greater because we have endured toil and suffering. Certainly, the suffering itself doesn't bring us pleasure or make us necessarily feel happy. But even in the midst of it, we can still experience joy. The Christian writer G.K. Chesterton once wrote that joy is the gigantic secret of the Christian. And he kind of meant it this way. He said, for us as Christians, we can be joyful about the big picture of life. That the biggest meaning of what life is, knowing that God is with us, that he desires to take care of us, that he's become one of us at Christmas, and that he offers his life upon the cross so that he can help draw us out of sin and suffering. That he's in control. Knowing that, there's a joy in the big picture. And in the midst of that, we can be quite sad about some of those specific things that occur day to day. Compare that to somebody who doesn't have that kind of big picture, that they have to kind of pretend to be happy about all the little things. That's what's got to kind of make them joyful, because they're sad about the big picture, that what's here is all there is. In our second reading, St. James says to take the example of the hardships and the patience of the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. So really the most joyful of people are those closest to God, the saints. But the saints were joyful in the midst of sorrow and suffering, not because they didn't have to experience any of those things. Most of the saints endured probably even more difficult hardships than we do. John the Baptist, for example, as he's speaking here in the gospel, he's doing so from prison. And not long after this, he's going to become a martyr. He'll be beheaded. As Catholics, we don't profess the prosperity gospel that's sometimes portrayed through televangelists. It might sound good at first that, God will give you all the awesome stuff that you want as long as you're faithful to him. Well, that isn't necessarily true. We won't always get pleasures on this earth. That's kind of what that idea kind of mistakens pleasure for what real joy ought to be. The martyrs wouldn't be all that impressed by that idea, because they certainly didn't experience pleasure or feel happy when they were offering their lives. But when you read how they go about it, they were experiencing deep joy. So how can we be like that? How can we be like, a St. Paul who could say, I rejoice in my sufferings, even experiencing joy in the midst of hardship? Well, to experience joy, it requires love, as Thomas said, but also trust. We've probably known people that kind of get suspicious or mistrusting. They can't let go of things, and they end up being rather miserable about life. They can't find joy because they can't trust. They can't trust the love of someone else. But we need to have that kind of trust, that faith in God, in his love, in order to have joy. And to do that, it means we have to surrender ourselves to him, to rely on him. But that's really kind of the difficult thing for us at times. It's not always easy to really truly turn our whole self over to him, to really surrender to God. But I can say that every time that I've been able to say yes to God, been able to say, I want your will, and not just say it, but really mean it, really want what is his will for me rather than my own, to the extent that I can say that, then I experience joy. And not just joy later, but joy right then at that moment when we give it over to God. And really that's precisely to the extent that we'll find joy, is to the extent that we can give that and trust it to Him. But to do that to completely is not always easy. We have to let go of ourself and our self-will, our control of things. But if we let Him, then God will put to death our old self, selfish, unhappy, bored, wretched, mistrusting, and instead fill us with joy. But He'll do it only if we want Him to. The greatest gift that Jesus desires from us this Christmas is us, our whole selves, trusting in Him. And in return, we will find nothing less than His joy.